In 2008, when this book was published, the art book scene for video games was very different. Basically, they only existed as part of a collector's edition. A full, independently released art book for a game wasn't really a thing outside of Japan. But, as is so often the case in the history of art making and media tie-in books, you'll usually find Star Wars leading the pack. Not only in a pioneering sense, but also just in the ability to consistently produce works of quality. Also, not only is this book interesting due to it being one of the earliest steps that got us to where we are today with seemingly every major game having its own art book, it's also fairly unique due to its being an art and making of book for a video game. I'm aware of probably fewer than 10 such books. And I suppose that's probably the most important thing to be aware of, that this is not just an art book and so may not include as much art as you might expect if you're comparing it to the quantity of a regular art book, since there's a lot more text here for the making of. Plus, it's only got 170 pages, and I'd say it averages out to 2 images per page, which is not a great ratio for a concept art or even just a visual book of this kind, but it's also not bad. Even though it may lack the quantity of art found in other art books, this one absolutely makes up for that and leaves them in the dust through outstanding curation. To the point that that's essentially the thing that makes this book worth it, and it doesn't really have to do with how much I personally admire the artworks themselves. In fact, I find a lot of it unappealing due to it using that rough, sketchy, digital painting style we so often see for concept art, but despite that, I still enjoyed almost all of it anyway due to the curation, which focuses largely on showcasing early and unused concepts, rather than just finer-looking crap that offers no interest. And of course, there's still a bit of that present here, isolated model sheet type stuff, but here it feels used just as a spice to get some variety rather than being the whole meal itself. And the variety of types of art it shows throughout is excellent. Also, when it is showing stuff that is more final looking, they've frequently chosen the true concept art and inspirational narrative and action illustrations that are still visually interesting and enjoyable in their own right, and so a good inclusion anyway. That this early video game art book so clearly identifies the types of art that are the most interesting and valuable to include reflects highly on it when 15 years later most art books completely fail to do this. Actually, that's probably more just a reflection of how poorly handled they are. Regardless of that, and regardless of what I think of the style of the art itself, the images are so well chosen. The emphasis on using an art book to show the early, alternate, and abandoned ideas is something of a hallmark I associate with the best Star Wars art books that makes them stand out as a cut above the rest, so it's great that this book contributes to that legacy. Also really nice is the effort put into the tailored and highly designed pages. Overall, it's a good display of satisfying form and function. The only exceptions to that being one really bad standout chapter that I'll talk about later, and they definitely could have and should have included more art via some images being better sized. Maybe the most important thing to establish is, what does this book mean by making of? Because that's very broad, and what it actually covers and how you may find unexpected, disappointing, and delightful. So first I want to discuss the text in general, and then we'll go into the specifics of each chapter. It's written by the Force Unleashed's project lead and one of the producers, and it's more about conceptual creation rather than technical creation, so primarily writing and concept, story, characters, and world-building related stuff. After that, the next biggest focus is gameplay concepts and then art. But even that probably gets a lot less discussion than you'd expect, and largely that's it. There's still a fair amount of stuff on other areas related to making the game, but these are just sidebars or one page presented as very general, basic overviews of like casting or something. And then beyond that, there's plenty of areas that are completely absent, so certainly don't be expecting any sort of all-encompassing or technical look at how games are made. I imagine this will disappoint some people who were hoping for a more robust representation of all or even just more areas that go into the making of a game, particularly given the title and how rare it is for books on a single game to cover that stuff. However, I don't think that's a problem at all. Yeah, of course it would be cool to get more information on more stuff, but there's only so much you can do in one book. How many making of books have we seen rendered completely unavailing in their attempts to give service level coverage to as many areas as possible? So that they didn't try to do that here is absolutely the right decision. Theoretically anyway. In practice, they've still not executed the idea well, and indeed, just as often they then actually do the opposite. It still falls into too many of the same traps as many other art making of books, being such a light, basic, generalized, shallow overview, lacking a lot of the hard-hitting behind-the-scenes detail, richness, and insight, and just ends up being underwhelming, obvious, and boring. Yes, there's only a limited amount of space, so it can't go deep, of course, but that's not the problem. It's that even considering that limitation, the information is poorly chosen and the word count poorly used. It wastes too much on setting the scene and unnecessary surface-level, basic generalized explanations. With such limited space, it needs to trim the fat and get to the meat quicker. But even then, a lot of what they're trying to pass off as meat is just telling you about characters and story that you already know from playing the game. And most odious of all is discussing gameplay and features in a way that sounds purely like they're trying to hype up the game. And so for like 75% of the text, the overall impression is that it just feels like the sort of thing you'd read in a pre-release article in a gaming magazine. However, there's also 25% of the text that displays really great ideas and information. Almost all of that is on display in the first 2 chapters, totaling 40 pages or a quarter of the book, and it's easily the best part. It's all focused just on the development of the ideas and story. And like I said before, that's the primary, almost exclusive focus throughout the book. And I love that it had the sense to focus on making at least one aspect meaningful, even if at the expense of other areas, because it's more thorough, insightful, and engaging. For example, the whole first chapter is about art and text for other ideas they had for games during their Blue Sky brainstorming. Some may say that's not relevant enough to warrant taking up that much space, which I think is a valid opinion, but I think it's awesome because it's a bunch of stuff that otherwise would go completely unseen and unknown. Plus, they also do a really good job of showing how aspects of those other ideas for games influenced and bear fruit in the Force Unleashed's history and development, so it's not like it's totally irrelevant anyway. From there, we chart the evolution of the concept and writing of the Force Unleashed more specifically. It is very much still done in a fleeting overview style that displays some of the criticisms I mentioned with the text, and though I wouldn't call it densely information-packed, but overall it does a great job of conveying the short version history of the development of this game, at least in terms of the concept and story ideas, and also backing that up with enough great insight and information. Again, pretty much all based around the idea of exploration, early, alternate, and cut ideas, just as with the art, so it's cool the images and text are both rowing in the same direction. One of the writing's big strengths that a lot of other books lack is that rather than just stating stuff, it actually offers explanations to give insight. One of the writing's biggest weaknesses is that it takes this too far and over-explains things that it really doesn't need to. Just way too much space over-explaining things in the most insultingly basic, obvious, and generalized way. Overall, the text sticks way too close to surface level and way too much telling the reader things they can discern on their own, and unfortunately this shallow and mundane approach to most of the text is what characterizes it. It's interesting how clearly you can chart the perfectly consistent decline of the text as this book moves from chapter to chapter. So the next quarter of the book is on the characters and the text becomes more hit and miss, still displaying some good stuff and continuing the same making of focus as the previous chapter, which is great, but now it feels like about half the time it does away with that, instead saying the most obvious, banal stuff, telling you who the character is and describing things you'd know from playing the game, or otherwise just trying to pass off shallow, vapid recounting as behind-the-scenes insight. Speaking of characters, I am someone who is an absolute sucker for books that include interactive elements. At the time, Inside Editions, the publisher, often used to do this really well with many of their art books, and they were such fun, creative additions to the book. This book includes the worst, most lazy, pointless, joyless example of that I've ever seen. Throughout the book, there are 2 little glued-in envelopes that each contain 5 character cards. On the front of the card is a piece of art already included in the book, and on the back is just like a character profile. An absolutely inane and worthless inclusion. Next up is the environment chapter, which is not only the biggest, but also the worst, to a weirdly noticeable degree compared to the rest of the book. All of a sudden, the text becomes far more scarce, and when it is present, it's just telling you about the story, about the location, and maybe mentioning some of the gameplay features from the level. Worse than that, it includes far fewer images, spreading a lot of them across the gutter, and even filling up entire spreads with one image becomes a feature. These things are all observable throughout the whole book, but only as exceptions, whereas it's the opposite in this chapter, with those negatives being the defining characteristic. So I don't know what happened there, but thankfully at least the environment section still upholds the consistently awesome direction for its art curation, and I particularly liked the spread on planets they explored but ultimately cut. The penultimate chapter is 15 pages where it breaks from the writing-based making of to mention some of the technology and software used to bring the game to life. I think it's good that it took a little break just to acknowledge some of the other behind-the-scenes areas. The execution, however, makes me think that maybe it's for the best that we don't get many making-of books for games if this is what it's like. It discusses it all from such a high overview in such a basic, generalized way that it could be talking about any game, rather than mentioning much to do with any specific game design behind-the-scenes insight that's actually interesting. Because even when it does talk about this game, again, it's just about talking up the features. As ever, however, at least the image curation never flags. In this section, it does include those sort of software work-in-progress screenshots, which obviously aren't as exciting as art, but still well chosen, adds some variety, conforms to the established direction, and supports the text. And then lastly, there's a 7-page highlight reel summarizing some milestones in the game's creation. Both these sections sound nice in theory, but in reality are completely worthless wastes of space. Except, of course, the images, which even at this end stage is still mostly showing early and unused stuff, so that's something. The change of focus for those last two sections really proves what I was saying about it being a good idea that the rest of this book's text just focuses on story development, that it's better to cover one thing well and offer something meaningful rather than attempting to cover too much too quickly from such a high overview that you offer nothing of substance, which is what we see in those last chapters. And it also shows the danger that even if you have a good concept and idea for the text, it can still backfire disastrously if it's not good and just wasting space. At which point it's like, well, this would have been better had it just been a pure art book. At only 170 pages, this book definitely would have benefited from more pages, either from the perspective of being able to include more art, or of having the space for a larger word count could help overcome the short, swift, shallow nature of the text. Though obviously that's only if the opportunity is used correctly, otherwise it'll just lead to even more pointless fluff. That this book maintained that writing and exploratory focused making of for the first 4 chapters rather than making the whole book like the last 2 sections and try to cover everything, that really saved it in a big way though, particularly given that they can barely even manage to include enough worthy text to do right by that single focus. But because of that, even as you get into the character and environment chapters where the text starts to drop off, at least when those good parts do crop up, they're still contributing to the overarching, deeper reward and experience of the book. And this is why, even though the text is not well executed in its specifics, and indeed the book overall has some areas to improve, and it is certainly not going to appeal to or satisfy everyone, but more than enjoying this book, I admire it. And for many art books I can say the opposite, but it's rare that I can say that, because I can see really good ideas here, even if the execution doesn't always live up to them, except for the image curation, which, quantity aside perhaps, is otherwise a definite home run, but for the rest, particularly the text, it only seems to be due to being innocently misguided rather than through the thoughtless, lazy, perfunctory handling we see for so many books, which you can tell is the case because this book clearly displays effort, and that's what I love. Of course, effort versus laziness doesn't actually matter and is disappointing if the end result is still a lacking and wasted opportunity. That doesn't change the appeal or opinion of this specific book, but I mean, first of all, this is not a bad book anyway. I'm just talking in the bigger picture, conceptual sense that at least it's constructive and hopeful. And again, for an early video game book of this kind, it is leading in the right direction. My biggest disappointment is that rather than standing on the shoulders of this book, 15 years later, there are still so many ideas here that most art books don't even attempt to live up to or to learn from. And this book still outshines them on those fronts. Concept, design, curation, and even the idea of the text providing a more focused making of. It's funny, we always expect as time goes on things only improve and get better, but last year, Inside Editions, the publisher of this book, released another rare example of the art and making of book for a video game. This time for Hogwarts Legacy, but it was just a complete dud. It's depressing to see publishers and creators who have so little pride in their work that even all these years later they've not only not learned anything and strived to improve, but rather don't give a shit about that and have actually taken steps back on almost every front, except for better binding and page count, but those are just production supports for the perfunctory, underwhelming content, so who cares? That's why I admire this book, even if I don't personally find appeal in many of the artworks themselves or find the book especially satisfying. I overall consider it worthy of note and interest. Sadly, there was no opportunity for them to make improvements for The Force Unleashed 2 because there was no art book for that game. Also, a second ago I kind of alluded to the fact that, as with many books published by Insight during this period, this book's binding is absolute garbage that falls apart in your hands, so that's something you may want to inquire about if you try to buy a copy online.